Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to sift through the noise and really get to the heart of the stories shaping our world. Today, we're taking a plunge into something, well, truly layered. It centers around Rebecca Lamb, who many know for her spiritual insights. We've got quite a bit of source material here, and honestly, it presents a fascinating challenge. On one hand, you have Rebecca's very, very personal story, a spiritual revelation, intense vulnerability. But then on the other side, there's this very public controversy, involves family, faith, and what some see as inconsistencies. It's really sparked a lot of talk online. So our mission today is pretty clear. We want to carefully unpack what's really going on in these sources. We'll explore Rebecca's powerful journey of self-worth, how she describes it. But crucially, we also need to look at the public side. How do those beliefs play out in the real world? Especially with tough family dynamics and, well, a very influential network involved. It definitely raises some big questions.
Yeah, and to really get it, you need to know where this all kicked off. A lot of this stems from a recent podcast interview. Rebecca shared what she called her darkest spiritual struggle very openly. And that interview, it got a huge reaction, especially from Dire Network viewers. Rebecca's pretty prominent there. So what we'll do is look at her beliefs, the things she said, and then compare that with how people perceived her actions. Where do they line up? And where, for some, do they seem to, well, diverge?
Exactly. And as we were digging into this, piecing together her personal story and that public reaction, this real tension jumped out. And we think it will for you too, is this. How does a really profound spiritual awakening, something that should anchor you, right? How does that navigate public scrutiny? What happens when family loyalty, claims of injustice, and maybe institutional pressure get thrown into the mix? It's a stark example of that clash. Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start right at the core of Rebecca's personal story. Her revelation. Our sources describe this moment of just incredible honesty before God, as she puts it. She talked about feeling useless, like I'm just not worth much, believing she had nothing of value to offer. That's a feeling I think many of us have unfortunately touched at some point, right? That sense of not being enough. But then the story takes this really unexpected turn. In that vulnerability, she sensed something, what felt like God's anger. Now, the sources are really clear. This wasn't like punitive anger, not judgment. It was described more as a divine sadness. Like God was heartbroken that she saw herself in such, well, a distorted, untrue way. That's a powerful difference.
Right. And what's fascinating here, what Rebecca realized, was pretty crucial. She understood that accepting that lie, I'm not worthy, my life has no meaning, it wasn't just hurting her. It actually, as she described it, grieved the heart of God. And the spiritual reason for that, based on the material, is because humans are created in his image. So if you reject your own value, you're essentially rejecting something sacred about how God made you. It's a call to see that intrinsic worth, not just for you, but like out of reverence.
Exactly. And her story goes on to detail this pretty significant personal transformation. Moving beyond that struggle, she said she stopped striving so hard to earn approval from people, which, is such a common trap. Instead, she started living with a genuine desire to make a meaningful impact, driven by wanting to reflect God's love. It sounds like real liberation, finding purpose.
In this journey, Rebecca's specific story, it does raise a really powerful question for all of us, doesn't it? When you think about her realization that undervaluing herself hurt God's heart, it makes you wonder, how often do we do that? Dismiss our own gifts, downplay our worth, and what are the deeper implications, not just personally, but maybe spiritually too? It's kind of the foundation of her testimony.
Okay, so she shares this incredibly personal thing,
Yeah.
right? But it quickly steps onto a very public stage. When we look at the reaction to her interview, there's this interesting split. Some listeners definitely heard it as a powerful portrayal of God's love. They were inspired. But our research also shows this noticeable wave of criticism started bubbling up, especially on social media from Dire Network viewers. The conversation shifted. And let's be really clear about the criticism. It wasn't about rejecting the spiritual message itself. Lots of people connected with that. The frustration was really about what many saw as a lack of consistency, a gap between the message she preached and her actions in real life. That's the key here.
Yeah, and if you put that in the context of Dire Network, the family, it makes sense. Many viewers felt she failed to extend that same kind of grace and compassion toward her own family members. Specifically, Jonathan and Susie Lamb, her extended family. It was about her perceived stance, or maybe lack of stance, regarding them, that perceived disconnect. That became the real sticking point for people. How did these big ideas translate into how you treat people, especially family?
Right. The core of the frustration reading through the material was this. It was, quote, difficult to reconcile Rebecca's message of divine love and identity with what they perceived as a lack of support for Jonathan and Susie and their young daughter, quote. This was during an incredibly painful and, frankly, controversial time at Dyer Network. Viewers were pretty blunt. They felt Rebecca had not lived out the very grace she preached. And that public feeling created this real tension, you know? It challenged the integrity of her testimony, makes you look hard at that gap between belief and behavior. So let's dig into the specifics of the controversy a bit more. A major point, according to our sources, is the claim that both Rebecca and her husband, J.W., had been first-hand witnesses to some really heartbreaking events involving Jonathan and Susie's young daughter. These events centered on Pete, another Lamb family member, who's been accused of some deeply disturbing things. This detail matters because it suggests they weren't just hearing rumors. They might have had direct knowledge. They would have understood the family's pain. And according to people reportedly close to it all, their first reaction, Rebecca and J.W.'s. It was apparently really strong. They were described as visibly shaken, emotionally impacted, just genuinely horrified by what they saw and heard. And it wasn't just feeling bad. They apparently gave strong verbal support to Jonathan and Susie. It sounded like clear solidarity at first.
Right. And more than that, our sources talk about alleged promises made in those early, maybe emotional conversations. Rebecca and J.W. reportedly told Jonathan and Susie if legal action was ever taken, if Pete were to be prosecuted, they would stand by them without hesitation. That kind of promise, described as heartfelt and firm, suggests a real initial moral clarity and conviction. It wasn't just sympathy, it was a commitment, seemingly, to support justice for a child.
Okay, and here's where the narrative, honestly, it takes a really troubling turn. Because over time, days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Something seemed to change a lot. That vocal support, the strong words that apparently came so easily at first, it started to fade. It became noticeably quieter on the issue. Those initial statements just dwindled. Eventually, it became silence. And that contrast from seemingly unequivocal support to silence, that's what has so many people deeply concerned.
Yeah, that shift, that silence. For many people watching, it wasn't just seen as them changing their minds. It was widely interpreted as complicity, or at the very least, a really painful abandonment of family right when they needed support most. When people who seemed so supportive suddenly go quiet about alleged injustice, it naturally raises some really hard questions about motives, loyalties, what their convictions really cost.
And that shift, that silence, it leads right to the big unanswered question in all this material. What might have prompted such a profound change in their posture, their promises? That seems to be the question hanging over this whole thing. Why the change? The public doesn't seem to have an answer yet.
Well, the speculation among the Dyer audience, as our sources point out, is that Rebecca and J.W. may have since aligned themselves with the more official narrative coming from Dyer, specifically the version pushed by Johnny Lamb, the network's current president. And that's critical because Johnny Lamb has publicly accused Jonathan and Susie of fabricating their allegations against Pete. So it forces a choice, really, a painful family split.
And our sources definitely explore the supposed benefits of staying loyal to that official line. They talk about alleged significant perks tied to loyalty within the ministry, especially to Johnny Lamb. We're talking things like substantial salaries, lavish homes, maybe funded by the ministry, private jets, big media platforms, connections to, powerful political figures. These aren't small things. It's a whole lifestyle of comfort, influence, status.
Which brings up a really, really important question the source material puts right in front of us. Could these privileges, this access to wealth, power, platform, could that have influenced their change? Did the appeal of those benefits start to outweigh that earlier promise to stand with Jonathan and Susie, to support justice for their daughter? It really forces you to think about how powerful those external pulls can be when you face tough moral choices.
Indeed. And the sources highlight these troubling questions, still lingering for observers. Did the promise of comfort, of wealth, of status, did that become more important than standing for truth? And more pointedly, was the safety, the well-being of a vulnerable child kind of pushed aside to protect relationships, positions, reputations inside the DR empire? These are heavy questions, and the silence just makes them echo louder.
The ethical dilemma is just stark. If Rebecca and J.W. knew things, if they saw or heard stuff that could clarify the truth about Pete, why stay silent? To people on the outside, that reluctance, it feels like more than just hesitation. It suggests something else might be going on, maybe protecting personal interests, professional ones. Even if justice for a child is potentially the cost, that's the uncomfortable place this leaves people.
So where does this leave us? Let's try to connect the dots here. Connect this specific family crisis, this public debate, back to that deeper spiritual truth the sources talk about. The very truth Rebecca herself spoke about so powerfully.
Right. The sources keep coming back to this message about genuine identity, that finding your true identity in Christ, it can't be rooted in titles, status, wealth, or, what people think of you. It has to begin by looking to God, because when you begin to see yourself through his eyes, everything shifts. That's the core principle she talked about, grounding your worth in something lasting.
And the outcome described is really compelling, isn't it? Instead of
Yeah.
always chasing worldly success, material things, a life based on that deeper identity lets you live out of a place of purpose and truth. You're motivated to reflect God's love, bring light. It's a vision of integrity, right? Of impact.
Which brings us right back to those challenging, universal questions from the sources. Questions really for you, the listener, to reflect on. In our own lives, facing tough choices, are we living for approval? Or are we living for truth? Are our decisions driven by fear of lost comfort, status, relationships? Or are they driven by a desire to carry the light of our convictions, especially when it's hard, even when it costs us something? These are the big questions Rebecca's whole story brings up.
Yeah, in the specific context here, the material really underscores how Rebecca and JW's silence feels so noticeable now. And for many, it's honestly disappointing. It goes beyond just them. It opens up these deeper questions about honesty, accountability, those really tough calls when truth bumps up against comfort, money, loyalty to an institution. It's a real-world test of ideals. This deep dive has really shown a powerful tension, hasn't it? You've got Rebecca Lemb's profound, inspiring personal words about faith and self-worth, and then you have the public perception of her actions when facing this painful family crisis, facing the pressures, the privileges of a big platform. It's a story that really makes you think, makes you examine that gap that can sometimes open up between what we say we believe and the choices we actually make.
And as we wrap up, the sources leave us with one last kind of provocative thought, something for you to really mull over. Do you think Rebecca's deeply held belief about being created in God's image, her intrinsic worth, does that ultimately line up with how she responded to what happened at Dire Network? It really asks each of us to think about what it means to live our convictions, especially, like the source says, when it's hard, even when it costs us something. That might be the real test.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into some really complex issues. We hope it prompts further thought, reminding us all about the importance of looking inward when facing tough decisions about faith, family, and accountability. Until next time.